A cream-colored envelope arrived on a Tuesday, slipped under his office door without a knock. On the glass desk of the 38th floor, beside a silver-framed photo of a 6-year-old boy with a chipped front tooth. Andrew Calloway picked it up. Inside, gold letters announced a high school class reunion. Beneath them, one handwritten line in blue ink. "Come let the old crowd see what became of you." Drew knew the handwriting before he finished the sentence. It belonged to the boy who, in 11th grade math, had read his failing score aloud while the class laughed. Drew did not crumple the card. He did not smile. He set it face down on the glass and looked out at the autumn light fading across the river. 10 years was long enough to be remembered as the dumbest boy in class, and long enough to become someone they would not recognize. The autumn light kept fading. Drew stood at the window for another minute after the envelope went face down his palm, resting flat against the glass that ran from floor to ceiling along the west side of the office. From up here, the river looked smaller than it was the way most things did when seen from far enough away. He had bought this view 3 years ago, the same week he had moved Theo into the brownstone in the Heights. The same week he had finally stopped sleeping on couches at the office. He turned away from the window and walked back to the desk. The card was where he had left it. He picked up the photo instead. Theo was 3 in the picture, holding a plastic dump truck above his head, like a trophy. His front tooth already chipped from a fall off the back porch that the boy still talked about, as if it had been a battle. Drew set the frame back down beside the envelope and looked at the two objects together, a sun and a sentence, and tried to remember for a moment what it was like to be the boy who would have been afraid of that handwriting. He could remember the room. That had never gone away. The fluorescent buzz in Mrs. Harris's 11th grade math classroom in Maple Hollow, Ohio. The way the second hand on the wall clock skipped instead of swept. The smell of overheated radiator and damp wool jackets in early November. Drew had sat in the second to last row by the window because the window meant he could look at something other than the board when his eyes started to slide off the numbers. He had not known then that there was a name for what happened when he looked at numbers. He had only known what everyone else seemed to have decided, that he was slow. His father, a welder, who worked 3 shifts at the truck plant outside town and came home with his forearms streaked black, would sit with him at the kitchen table some nights and try to walk him through long division, a huge scarred hand resting on the page beside the figures. "Take it slow, son. They're just numbers." But the numbers would not hold still. They drifted on the page like things that wanted to be anywhere else, and after an hour his father's patience would thin into a quiet that was somehow worse than yelling. Drew's mother had died when he was 9, of an aneurysm one morning in the kitchen, and after that, the house had carried a permanent hush in it. There was no one to translate his father's silence. Drew had learned to interpret it himself, and he had interpreted it mostly as disappointment. At school, the disappointment had a louder face. It belonged to Carter Holt. Carter had been the only son of the only family in Maple Hollow that mattered. The Holts had built the foundry off Route 40 in 1963 and had been on the front page of the local paper at least once a year ever since. Carter wore pressed polo shirts to school when most boys wore whatever their fathers wore on weekends. He was the valedictorian by junior year. He won the regional debate trophy and the state engineering competition in the same spring. The teachers loved him in the polite, careful way teachers love students whose parents fund the new gymnasium. The rest of the class loved him in the harder way teenagers love a winner. They laughed when he laughed, and they laughed at whoever he was laughing at. What Drew did not know then, and would not know for a long time, was that every one of those trophies came home to a father who looked at them once and asked what came next. Bradford Holt had inherited the foundry from his own father and had spent his life trying to prove he deserved it. He had a way of looking at Carter's report card, the way a man looks at a mirror he does not like, searching for the flaw. An A in chemistry meant a question about why it was not an A+, A debate win meant a comment about the slouch in the rebuttal. Carter had learned somewhere around the age of 12 that there was only one feeling worse than being the second-best son in your father's eyes, and that was being a son in a room with no one underneath you. The trick was to make sure there was always someone underneath you. The trick was to make sure everyone in the room knew who that someone was. Drew Calloway with his quiet, his cheap sneakers, his failing math papers. His dead mother, Drew, was a perfect shadow. Carter did not have to invent him. He only had to point. The morning of the test in November of their junior year, Carter had come to school in a mood Drew did not understand at the time. He had been quieter than usual at his locker, his jaw set in a way that made the other boys in his orbit careful around him. None of them knew that an hour earlier, in the breakfast nook of the Holt house on Birch Ridge Road, Bradford Holt had opened an envelope from the Princeton Review with Carter's diagnostic SAT score and had set it down without a word, only a long, hard look across the table that had said the same thing it always said. Not enough. Carter had taken the bus to school with that look pressed against the inside of his ribs. He had walked into Mrs. Harris's classroom with it. He had needed very badly that morning to put it somewhere else. Mrs. Harris had passed back the test papers and stepped into the hall to take a phone call. Drew had turned his over and seen the red 34 across the top of the page and felt the familiar hot crawl up the back of his neck. He had folded the paper in half before he had finished feeling it. He had not seen Carter come around the desk. "Let me see that, Calloway." The room had gone quiet in the way rooms do when something is about to happen. Drew had not let go of the paper at first. Carter had not asked again. He had simply taken it from between Drew's fingers, walked to the front of the room with it, and held it up like a piece of evidence in a courtroom no one had agreed to convene. Drew Calloway, 34 out of 100. Someone in the back row laughed first. Then it spread the way it always did, the way laughter in 11th grade always doesn't, because anything was funny, but because the alternative was to sit there in the silence and feel something. Carter let the laughter carry for another second before he added the line that Drew would carry word for word for the next 10 years. "Hey, Drew, even a calculator can't save you." The room laughed harder. Drew did not lift his eyes. He stared at the worn groove in the wood of his desk, where some other kid years ago had carved a single letter and then given up. He felt his face burning his hands cold. And in the very small space inside his own head, where Carter could not reach, he told himself a sentence he did not yet know he was making a promise out of. One day, numbers were going to work for him, not against him. Mrs. Harris came back into the room. Carter handed the paper to her with a smile and went back to his seat. The test was returned to Drew face down. The bell rang. Drew walked home through wet leaves and did not tell his father what had happened, and did not tell anyone, and began that night in a way he did not yet have words for to build something. 10 years later, on the 38th floor, the something he had built employed 84 people, and was beginning to show up in places where the Calloway name had never been before. It did not have his face on it. He had been careful about that. He had given it a quiet name and a quieter logo, and had let the work speak in a language the work understood, which was numbers, which were now his. Drew picked up the invitation again. He read the line a second time, in case the second reading did something the first had not. It did not. The handwriting was still Carter's. The reunion was a month away on a Saturday in October at the old Hartwell estate just outside Maple Hollow, the kind of venue people rented when they wanted the photographs to look like they had grown up somewhere they had not. Below the handwritten line in smaller print was a website where guests could RSVP and pay the per-plate fee. He set the card down. From down the hall, very faintly, he could hear his assistant's voice on the phone, and beyond that, the soft, mechanical breath of the building. He sat down in his chair and turned it toward the window, and he thought about Theo. Theo was 6. Theo had been 3 when his mother, Marion, who had taught 2nd grade at the public school in Wilton and had laughed the way some people sing easily, and often had been killed by a driver who ran a red light at an intersection she crossed every morning. Drew had been at the office when the call came. He had not been there when she had died. He carried that, and he would always carry it, and it was the bone underneath every other thing in his life now. Theo did not remember her, except in fragments the smell of a sweater, a particular way of saying his name. Drew had become, in the 3 years since, the only steady thing in a small boy's small world. He worked from home 2 days a week. He cooked dinner badly and on time. He read the same picture book about a tugboat 73 nights in a row without complaining. He had a reason not to go back to Maple Hollow. He had the best reason in the world. A son did not need a father who chased ghosts. But there was another reason, and it was harder to name, and it sat under the first one the way bedrock sits under a foundation. Theo was going to grow up. Theo was going to come home from school one day with a story about a boy in his class who had said something cruel, and Drew was going to have to look him in the eye and tell him something true about how a person carries that. Drew did not yet know what he was going to say. He only knew that whatever he said, he wanted to be able to say it as a man who had not spent his life keeping his back turned to the room he had once been small in. He picked up the card a third time, and this time he opened the laptop on his desk and went to the RSVP page, and he typed his name, and he clicked yes. Then he closed the laptop and sat in the dark for a while. Across the river, the lights of the city were coming on one by one. Drew did not sleep much that first night. He went home around 11, kissed Theo's forehead, where the boy had fallen asleep on the couch with the tugboat book tented across his chest, and carried him up the stairs to bed. He stood in the doorway of his son's room afterward for longer than he meant to. The hallway lamp threw a yellow strip across the carpet and over the small foot that had worked its way out from under the blanket. He stood there and tried to find the words for what he had agreed to do and could not find them yet. In the weeks that followed, 2 things happened in 2 different cities, on 2 parallel tracks neither man yet knew were converging. In Maple Hollow, in a paneled office on the 2nd floor of the Holt Foundry Administration Building, Carter Holt closed a door and locked it for the first time in his life. His father had walked out an hour earlier without saying goodbye. Bradford Holt had a way of leaving rooms that always felt like an accusation, and that morning the accusation was sharper than usual, because that morning Bradford had finally signed the paper that handed the company to his son, in name as well as in fact. And on his way out he had said the only thing he had ever said to Carter that sounded like a sentence and not a comparison. "Don't disappoint me." Carter sat at the desk that was now formally his and looked at the spreadsheets that had been informally his for almost a year. The numbers on those spreadsheets were the kind that did not improve with second readings. 2 of their 3 largest contracts had not been renewed for the coming fiscal year. The pension fund was leaking. The line of credit at the regional bank had been called in 2 weeks earlier in a letter Bradford had not shown him until that morning. The foundry had been running on the smell of its own legend for years, and Carter, who had once stood in front of an 11th grade math class and held up another boy's failing test like a banner, now sat alone with the figures that told him the banner had been carrying a hole in it the whole time. He had spent the last several months dialing every venture capital firm and every private equity desk whose number he could find. Most had not returned the calls. The ones that had returned them in the tone of people doing a favor by listening. He had pitched the foundry as a heritage asset, a turnaround story, a Midwestern manufacturing play with bones. He had heard polite no after polite no, and the politeness had been the worst part, because politeness from strangers was something Carter had never had to receive before. He had always been on the other side of it. Only one firm had even agreed to look at the deck twice. They were called Bridgeway Capital, and Carter knew almost nothing about them, except what the trade press knew, which was almost nothing. Bridgeway did not have a glossy website. Their founder was a name that appeared in filings as A. Calloway and nowhere else. They had quietly assembled a portfolio across industrial real estate regional banking, and middle-market manufacturing in a way that made the people who paid attention to such things lean forward and ask each other questions. Carter had sent his deck to Bridgeway in May. Bridgeway had said no. He had sent a revised deck in July. Bridgeway had said no. He had sent a third version in early September with a personal letter, and Bridgeway had said no a third time in a sentence so brief it had not even been signed by a person. He had been certain at that point that the door was closed. In another city on the 38th floor, Drew read the third version of Carter's deck, the way he had read the first two. Slowly. Once forward, once backward, once forward again. He kept a notebook on his lap for these. He wrote in it, in the kind of careful, deliberate hand that a person who once could not trust his numbers learns to write in. The deck was better than the second draft. The second draft had been better than the first. Carter Holt had been a student all his life, and he was still a student now, and he had learned even from rejection how to make a pitch tighter. But the numbers were not tighter. The numbers were the same numbers dressed differently. The foundry's revenue had been flat for a decade. The pension obligation was a ticking line item. The customer concentration was dangerous. The plant equipment needed $40 million of capital investment that the company did not have and could not borrow. And underneath all of it, the deck wore the same fingerprint Drew had recognized in version 1, a young chief executive who still talked about the business as if he were defending it to his father. Drew had said no the first time because he had been angry. He admitted that to himself plainly because he had spent the last 10 years building a habit of admitting things to himself plainly. He had recognized the surname on the cover page and had felt for the length of a breath the 11th grade hot crawl up the back of his neck, and he had written rejected across the email in his head before he had finished reading the executive summary. He had not been proud of that. He had told himself afterward that he would treat the second pitch as if it had come from anyone. He had treated the second pitch as if it had come from anyone, and he had still said no because the second pitch had still been a man defending his father. He had said no to the third for the same reason, with one difference. By the third reading, he had begun to see in the careful corrections from version to version something he had not expected to find in a deck from Carter Holt. He had begun to see effort. He had begun to see a person. He had not let himself sit with that for long. He had filed the deck in a drawer he did not open often, and he had gone back to work. That had been 3 days before the invitation. Drew did not believe in coincidences as a rule. He believed that the world ran on quiet patterns, and that most of what looked like fate was only pattern not yet recognized. But on the morning after he RSVP'd to the reunion, he sat at his desk for a long time and looked at the drawer where the Holt Industries pitch deck lived and at the cream-colored card now propped against the lamp. And he thought for the first time about the geometry of what was happening. Carter did not know the founder of Bridgeway by name. Bridgeway had been a wall of silence to him for 4 months. The reunion had been Carter's idea of a joke, and the man behind the wall was the joke. It was the kind of thing a younger Drew might have called revenge, and called it satisfying. The man he had become did not call it that. He looked at it, and felt only a quiet kind of vertigo the way a man feels who has stepped into a hallway and realized the hallway is also a mirror. He picked up the phone and called his head of operations. He told her that the firm would be hosting a brief offsite at the Hartwell estate the 2nd Saturday of October. He asked her to clear his calendar around it. He asked her to arrange transport. He did not say why. 2 days before the reunion in a corner of Carter Holt's increasingly small life, his phone began to ring with calls he had stopped expecting. A placement agent named Russell, a man Carter had met once at a trade conference, called on a Thursday afternoon and said he had something. Carter put down the bourbon he had been carrying around the office in a coffee mug and listened. Russell said that he had run into someone the night before who had run into someone else, and that the someone else was, of all people, a representative of Bridgeway Capital, and that the representative had said, and Russell was careful here, because Russell knew when to be careful, that the founder, the man whose name was a letter, was going to be in Ohio on Saturday on personal business, and that he had agreed, finally, to take a half-hour meeting with Carter on the side of it. Carter sat down at his desk. "You're sure?" he said into the phone. "You're sure it's him?" "I'm sure," Russell said. "I don't ask twice." Carter thanked him with a steadiness in his voice that surprised them both. He hung up. He sat with the phone in his hand for a long minute. Then he did something he had not done since his junior year of college. He laughed out loud in an empty room. He laughed in the way men laugh when they have been holding their breath for so long they had forgotten that exhaling was an option. That night, Carter went home and stood in his kitchen and poured himself something better than what he had been drinking at the office, and he opened the reunion group chat on his phone, and he typed, "Good news, gentlemen," Bridgeway finally tapped out. "The mystery guy is meeting me Saturday. Looks like there's at least one sober adult left in finance." 3 of his classmates wrote back within the hour. They said the things classmates say to a winner. They asked who the mystery guy was. Carter did not know who the mystery guy was. He answered that he would find out on Saturday. He did not connect in any of the 4 versions of his life that he ran through his head before falling asleep that night, the words, "Saturday in Ohio," and the words his own reunion. He had separated them in his mind, the way men separate the things that frighten them from the things that please them. The reunion was Saturday in Ohio. The meeting was Saturday in Ohio. He did not put them together. There was no reason in his world for those 2 facts to belong to the same sentence. In a brownstone in the Heights, the night before the reunion, Drew sat on the floor of his son's bedroom and read the Tugboat book for what felt like the 78th time. Theo was sprawled across the rug in his pajamas, 1 foot on Drew's knee, listening with the unembarrassed attention of a child who has not yet learned to pretend he is bored. When the book ended, Drew closed it and set it on the rug between them, and he did something he had not planned and could not later have explained as a plan. He started to tell the boy a story. He told Theo in the words a 6-year-old could hold that there had been a boy in his father's class who used to be unkind to him. He told him that the boy had read his test score out loud one day in front of everyone, and that everyone had laughed, and that Drew had walked home and not told anyone. He told him that the laughing had stayed with him for a long time. He told him that he had spent a lot of years afterward trying to get good at the very thing the boy had laughed at, and that he had gotten good at it, and that being good at it had made his life better in some ways. He did not say better in all ways. He did not lie to his son. Theo listened the way Theo listened to everything, which was carefully and from the bottom up. When the story ended, Theo turned his head against Drew's knee and looked up at him with the slightly furrowed forehead he had inherited from his mother. "So is that boy still mean now, Dad?" Drew looked down at him. He had thought for weeks that he knew what he was going to say in response to this question. He had rehearsed answers in his head, while shaving, while driving, while signing things he had not really read. Now that the question had actually been asked in the voice of his son in the room where his son slept, none of his rehearsed answers fit. He felt the shape of an honest answer rise into his throat and stop there. "I don't know yet, buddy," he said. "I'm going to find out tomorrow." Theo nodded, satisfied, in the way only a 6-year-old can be satisfied, with an answer that an adult knows is not really an answer. He held up his arms. Drew picked him up off the rug and carried him to bed. And he stood again in the doorway after the boy was asleep, and he understood more clearly than he had understood it the morning the envelope arrived why he was going. He was not going for Carter. He had not been going for Carter for a long time. He was going for the boy in the second to last row in November of his junior year, the one who had sat there with cold hands and a burning face, and made himself a promise he had not yet been able to look in the eye and tell the truth. The truth was that he had kept that promise. The numbers had come to work for him. They had built him a company, a view of a river, a home with his son in it. He had not yet stood in the room where he had first made the promise and said any of it out loud. Tomorrow, he was going to stand in that room. Saturday came up gray and cold. The leaves around Maple Hollow had finished turning the week before and were beginning to fall in earnest. The Hartwell estate sat on a low rise 3 miles outside town, an old Greek revival house with white columns and a long sloping lawn that ran down to a pond. The caterers arrived at 3. The bar opened at 5. By 6, the gravel turnaround in front of the columns was filling with the kind of cars that classmates rent for the weekend. Carter Holt arrived early in a dark blue suit he had bought for the meeting, more than for the reunion. His phone was in his jacket pocket. He had set it to vibrate. He had told 2 of his closer friends in passing that he had a small business thing to handle later in the evening, and they had nodded the nod of men who do not really listen, and he had moved on. He greeted the early arrivals in the foyer. He shook hands. He laughed at the right times. He drank 1 glass of bourbon very slowly and waited. At 6:43, his phone buzzed against his ribs. He stepped out into the hallway to read it. The text was from his assistant. 3 short words. Bridgeway rep arrived. Carter's mouth went dry. He stepped back into the main room. He scanned the foyer for a stranger in a suit, for some quiet man in middle age. Somebody's idea of a venture capitalist, a face he did not know. He saw instead the same 40-odd faces he had grown up with. Doug Ferreira from the football team, now bald. Beth Marston from Honors English, holding a glass of white wine. The Patrocino brothers, 2 of his oldest hangers-on by the window. No one knew. He frowned. He turned toward the long window at the back of the room, the one that gave onto the slope down to the pond. From the dark sky above the lawn, the rotor noise had been growing for perhaps 15 seconds before he registered it. A helicopter. Gray. Steel-bellied. Settling onto the grass with the slow, particular weight of a thing arriving on purpose. The conversation in the room thinned and then stopped the way conversation in a room stops when something larger than conversation has entered it. People moved toward the windows. Someone laughed, uncertain. Someone else made a joke about a wedding crashing. The cabin door opened. A man in a dark blue suit stepped out onto the grass, not hurrying, his coat folded once over his forearm. He crossed the lawn the way someone crosses a lawn he has thought about for a long time. Carter watched him through the window with the strange, cold feeling of a man whose 2 separate calendars have begun against his will to slide toward each other. The man came up the stone steps and through the open French doors at the back of the room, and Carter saw him fully in the indoor light for the first time in 10 years. The room found a voice before Carter did. Somebody whispered the name. Somebody else repeated it louder. The whisper traveled across the room the way a draft travels across a room. Carter felt it pass him without quite touching him. Drew Calloway stood in the doorway in the dark blue suit and looked for 1 long beat like a man who had walked into the exact room he had needed to walk into. Then he smiled a small, polite, unhurried smile and started across the floor toward the bar. Carter found his voice somewhere on the way. He stepped forward almost in front of Drew, the old reflex coming up, before the new information could stop it, and he heard himself say the line his 11th grade self would have said. Renting a helicopter for a class reunion. Expensive, Drew. The room around them quieted further. Drew stopped where he was. He looked at Carter the way a man looks at a photograph of someone he used to know. There was no anger in his face. There was no triumph. There was something quieter than either and harder to name. And in Carter's jacket pocket, the phone buzzed again against his ribs with a second message he had not yet read. Drew didn't smile. He didn't smirk. He just looked at Carter for a moment that felt longer than it was, and then he said, the line plainly with no weight on any one word, the way a man states a fact about weather. I didn't rent it, Carter. I bought it last year. The room around them did not so much react as adjust a small collective shifting of postures, a tilt of heads. Somebody near the window let out a soft, involuntary syllable that was not quite a word. Carter's smile, which had been hanging on his face from a height, his face was no longer high enough to support, slipped half an inch. And the house, Drew added, looking briefly around at the high ceilings, the columns, the long bones of the Hartwell. The estate has been part of the firm's real estate portfolio for about 2 years now. We rent it out on most weekends. They emailed me the booking last month, and I let it go through. He said this without flourish. He said it the way a person reads a delivery receipt aloud. Then he looked back at Carter, and he didn't add anything else. He didn't need to. He had said 2 things and put 2 stones on the table, and he was content, it appeared, to let Carter pick them up at his own pace. Carter could not just then pick them up. He felt the phone buzz against his ribs a second time, and his hand went to his pocket before his mind caught up with the hand. He pulled the phone out. He looked at the screen. Founder confirms. He's in the room. Says you've already met. He read it once. He read it again, slower. He looked up at Drew. He looked down at the phone. He looked up at Drew again. And in the space between the second look up and the third, something in Carter Holt's face, the thing that had been carefully assembled for the last decade out of pressed shirts and good handshakes, and the particular smile a son learns when his father is watching, came apart along a seam he had not known was there. His mouth opened. No sound came out of it. A. Calloway. Andrew Calloway. The letter in the filings was not a code. It was a first name, shortened the way the people who actually knew him still called him. He had been pitching 3 times 4 months, running the boy he had once held up to a laughing classroom. He had spent the previous evening in the kitchen of his own house, typing into a group chat that there was at least one sober adult left in finance, and the adult was Drew. And the meeting Russell had called him about. With such careful, valuable certainty, the meeting was happening right now. It was happening in this room. It had been happening since Drew had walked through the door. Carter stood in the middle of the room with the phone still in his hand. The room had gone very quiet, because something in the air had told the room, even without information, that the air had changed. He could feel the eyes on him. He could feel the heat under his collar. He could feel more than anything the absence of any sentence in his head, any line, any joke, any deflection. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, the trick he had been taught at 12, the trick of always having someone underneath you, so the room knew who you were, had failed him in front of the room. Drew watched all of this happen on Carter's face without saying anything, and then he turned away from Carter. Not unkindly, just turned and addressed the rest of the room the way a person addresses a room he has finally decided to stand in. "I want to say one thing while I'm here," Drew said. He said it at a normal speaking volume, but the room was so quiet that a normal speaking volume was enough. Heads angled toward him. A woman near the bar set her glass down on the wood. "I sat in this town's 11th grade math class," Drew said, "and I believed for years that I was slow. I believed it because most of the people in this room helped me believe it. I'm not telling you that to make you feel anything. I'm telling you because since then, I learned the actual word for what was happening to me when I looked at numbers. The word is dyscalculia. It's a wiring difference. About 1 in 20 people have some version of it. Nobody at our school knew the word. I didn't know the word until I was almost 20. By the time I learned it, I had already decided I was going to spend the rest of my life around numbers, partly out of stubbornness, and partly because I had a very specific sentence in my head from this very specific town that I was tired of carrying around." He looked at no one in particular as he said this. He looked, if anywhere, at the long window at the back of the room, the one that gave onto the lawn, and the helicopter still sitting on the grass, its rotor stilled. "I'm not slow," he said, "and I wasn't slow then. I process numbers differently, that's all. It took me a long time to know the difference between those 2 sentences, and I want to name the person who told me there was a difference because he never got any credit for it, and he should." He named him. He said the name George Pittman, and a few of the older heads in the room nodded the small nod of people who remembered a quiet man in a leather apron, in a workshop at the back of the building. Mr. Pittman taught the 10th grade shop class, Drew said. He let me come in during lunch to use the lathe. He watched me work for about 3 weeks before he said anything to me. And then one afternoon he said, "Andrew, you're not bad at math. You just haven't found your own language for it yet." That was the entire sentence. He didn't make a speech of it. He went back to grinding a piece of stock. I want to tell you that he is the reason my firm exists, and I want to tell you that he is. As of 2 years ago, the director of a scholarship program we fund for students with learning differences in 6 states. The program is named after me only because he refused to let it be named after him. We have placed 140 kids on it so far. We're aiming for 500 by the end of next year. He didn't look at Carter when he said any of this. He didn't have to. The whole room was looking at Carter, and Carter knew it. "That's all I wanted to say," Drew said. "I'm sorry to interrupt the evening." Then he turned and he walked not quickly across the room toward Carter Holt. He stopped about 2 steps from him, close enough for the conversation to be private, far enough for the body language to be clearly seen. He lowered his voice. The rest of the room, by instinct, did not lean in. "I read your deck 3 times, Carter," Drew said. Carter looked at him. The phone was still in Carter's hand. He had forgotten he was holding it. "The first time I said no because I was angry," Drew went on. "I'm telling you that straight, because I think we're past anything except straight. The second time, I said no, because I was still angry, and I didn't trust myself yet. The third time, I said no, because the deck still had real problems, and I needed to know I was telling you the truth, not paying you back." Carter's jaw moved once. Nothing came out. "Your company can be saved," Drew said. "The foundation is sound. The management is weak in 3 specific places I can show you on a single page. Your father handed you a ship with holes in it. You didn't drill them. You've been bailing the water on top of trying to learn how to steer at the same time, and nobody told you the difference between those 2 jobs." He let the words sit. He didn't soften them. He didn't sharpen them either. "If you want to hear what I actually think about the business," Drew said, "and not as charity, not as history, not as anything, except the work my office is on the 38th floor. Bring a clean copy of the deck. Don't bring your father." Carter's eyes moved. They did not move away from Drew. They moved as if they were trying to find a place inside Drew's face, where the boy from the 11th grade classroom still lived, and they could not find that place, because that place had been built over a long time ago by someone else. For the first time in 10 years, in front of the people who had spent a decade watching him have something clever to say about everything, Carter Holt could not find a joke. He did not try to find one. He nodded once the way a man nods when he understands a thing he is not yet ready to feel. Drew held out his hand. Carter took it. They shook once briefly the way men shake hands when the handshake is the entire conversation. Then Drew turned toward the back of the room, and he walked in the same unhurried way he had arrived out the open French doors and down the stone steps onto the lawn. The applause started behind him before he reached the helicopter. It did not start where he might have expected it to start. It started near the back of the room from a small cluster of people who had been quiet for most of the evening, a few of the women from the honors track, a former cross-country runner who had become a paramedic, a man Drew did not immediately recognize, who had taught middle school in town for the last 6 years. It spread from there. It was not loud. It was the kind of applause people give in a church when they are not sure whether applause is allowed, but they cannot help themselves. Carter did not turn to look at the door. He stood where Drew had left him in the middle of the floor, the phone still in one hand, and the future of his father's company resting in a folder on a side table near the window. For the first time looking at that folder, he was not thinking about Bradford Holt. He was thinking about himself alone, and about a 38th floor office a state away that he had never been to, and about whether he had the courage to bring a clean copy of his deck, and not bring his father with him in any other way either. Out on the lawn, the rotor wound up. The helicopter lifted, hung for a moment over the slope. then turned in the dark sky and slid east. The people inside the Hartwell stood at the windows and watched it go until the blinking light at the tail was indistinguishable from the cold autumn stars over the pond. It was after 11 when Drew came up the front steps of the brownstone in the Heights. The sitter met him in the hallway, gathered her coat, said the boy had only just gone down 20 minutes ago, and let herself out the front door without making any of it into anything. Drew stood in the front hall for a moment with his coat still on, listening to the quiet of his own house. He found Theo not in the bed, but on the couch in the living room, curled up under the gray throw blanket, with the tugboat book held against his chest, the way a smaller boy holds a stuffed animal. The lamp on the side table was still on. Theo had clearly waited as long as a 6-year-old could wait, and had lost the fight a few minutes before his father walked through the door. Drew took off his coat. He sat down on the rug in front of the couch the way he had sat on the rug in Theo's bedroom the night before, and he watched the boy's face in the lamplight. Theo's chipped front tooth showed a little the way it always did when he slept with his mouth slightly open. His eyelashes moved. After a while, Theo's eyes opened slowly in the unsurprised way of children who have been waiting for a particular person. "Hi, Dad," he said. "Hi, buddy." Theo blinked up at the ceiling for a few seconds the way he always did when he was crossing the bridge from sleep to awake. Then he turned his head, and he looked at his father, and he asked the question he had asked the night before. He asked it because he had been holding it for him. "So is that boy still mean now, Dad?" Drew looked at his son. He thought about Carter standing in the middle of the room with the phone in his hand. He thought about the seam that had opened in Carter's face when the message came in. He thought about the way Carter had nodded once, like a man who had just begun to understand a sentence, in a language he had never been taught. "I think that boy is learning how to stop being mean, Bud," Drew said. "I think it might take him a while." Theo considered this with the same furrowed forehead he had inherited from his mother. He seemed to find it acceptable. He reached out from under the blanket and put his small hand on top of his father's larger one, the way he sometimes did when he wanted to anchor a person to a moment. "Did you stand up?" he asked. Drew was not sure for a second what Theo meant. Then he understood. He understood that Theo had been holding all evening the only question that had ever really mattered. "Yes, buddy," he said. "I stood up." Theo nodded once. His eyes were already closing again. He kept his hand on top of his father's. Drew sat there in the lamplight for a long time after the boy was asleep again. He thought about a lot of things. He thought about Mrs. Harris's classroom, and about his father's scarred hand on a kitchen page, and about Mr. Pittman in the leather apron at the back of the shop. He thought about Marion briefly in the way he thought about her every day, not as a wound now, but as a presence the way a person thinks about the foundation of the house he lives in. He thought about Carter, and about the 38th floor, and about whether Carter would actually come. But mostly, he thought about Theo, and about the small, careful question Theo had asked at the end, and about how of all the things he had done that day, the only thing he would remember in 20 years would be the moment a 6-year-old put his hand on top of his and asked if he had stood up. He had not come home because he had won anything. He understood that sitting on the rug in the lamplight. He hadn't won anything. He had stood finally in a room he had spent 10 years not standing in, and he had said what he had needed to say, and he had walked out of that room of his own choosing. That was not a victory. It was something quieter and bigger than a victory. It was the simple fact that he had never really left the small Ohio town with the second-to-last row by the window, not until tonight, and now he had. The lamp threw its yellow circle over the boy and the blanket and the chipped tooth and the small hand on top of the larger one. Outside, somewhere across the river, the lights of the city kept on, the way they kept on every night, patient, ordinary, indifferent. Drew closed his eyes for a moment. Then he opened them, and he reached up, and he switched the lamp off.